We talked about the modern period of literary criticism, within which we, we try to focus on some prominent concept particularly, right? Uh, and as I stated in our previous lecture, that every period, some or the other way, creates kind of like a pathway for the new period, and exactly the notions of modern period can be seen somehow or the other way reflected in Victorian period. Now, previous to Victorian period, we have with us Romantic period, and to that we have Neoclassical period, and to that we have got Renaissance period. To that we have got Classical period, and accordingly, those various period go on changing, and their significance remains the same throughout the course of time, as it is, in a way carrying so many upgraded versions of criticism, as discussed earlier, and so we find them getting changed with all other sort of different otherwise the various approaches, and so we have seen them getting changed with the modern period of English literary criticism. Modern period, which spans us, which spans a time, no, which covers the time span of around 6 to 7 decades, exactly compared to other periods, the neoclassical period or romantic period or Victorian period. It is quite little, but and as it is in the modern period particularly, exactly. So what came, what was the in the yesterday's session we have seen. Uh, what is the pioneering factor? The pioneering factor for the commencement of modern period is that the process of questioning, exactly. And yes, so the process of question, and what has been questioned particularly, the modern critics, some of the other way, what came to them with inheritance about the meaning, the text, the truth, the facts, the meanings, and the explanations were questioned. Exactly, their systems were questioned, their processes were questioned, and their beliefs were questioned. The faith, the truth, the fact, the meaning that God came to them. So the poetry was questioned, the spreading factor of poetry was questioned, literary forms were questioned, and so this questioning and acceptance after an analysis, some or the other way, can be seen giving a rise to the modern period of English literary criticism, right? And thus, it remains a very much significant factor to understand on what certain things this modern period particularly relies. Exactly, there are in yesterday's session we have seen prominently the factors that factors we can say that shaped the period. We just had an overview of in yesterday's session. Then we talked about some figures, and also we have seen some. Right. So those many factors are there which we have greatly noticed in this very period particularly, and in our yesterday's lecture we have tried to sum up them. We just had a complete overlook of this period particularly, right? We didn't go to study about the period in much detail way, but we just had a kind of like a glimpse of the entire period, and then we shifted our focus from, you know, so we went on understanding how prominent figures like Matthew Arnold is considered, a bridge figure between Victorian thoughts and particularly the modern period otherwise. So, and his contribution in a way otherwise remains a very significant one particularly. Does so So it is much more of an importance to understand what kind of role does it play, and in what different sense we find that these notions are quite significant to be understood, right? So when we try to understand the overall impression of modern period, uh, as from my point of view, it is much more important to understand the various factors that have shaped the modern thoughts and ideas. Exactly, it's influencing factors what influenced the people of modern period particularly, right? Then the social conditions, for example, what inspired them, what kind of legacy they had, and how the surroundings otherwise contributed in shaping the ideas, beliefs, and emergence or commencement of new topics, ideas of discussion that were under the tree, that were under the shadow of modern period particularly can be seen. So in taking all those things into consideration, modern period in English literary criticism has its great importance. Now, the period that profoundly, or we can say in a way, spans from the beginning of 19th century to the mid 19th century, and should come up with many aspects of life, particularly feminism, Marxist theory, structuralism, formalism, psychoanalysis, the psychological notion, then Freudian theory, T.S. Eliot, uh, Lectio Correggio, individual talent. So many things are there that got greatly discussed, particularly, and we can see people like T.S. Eliot, I.A. Richards, Kenneth Brooks, who have played a kind of a great amount of contribution in case of shaping the thoughts, beliefs, and the critical ideas in the very particular period. All sort of those things we have seen in our previous lecture, and so those things matter the most because they are of a much concern. Keeping the net and set examination into our consideration, we have to get into touch with all those details very interesting way, because we may ask, we were asked about their works, the changes that were seen in their works, the different characters that they have discussed, the prominent critics who have dealt with prominent works of the contemporary period or had reference of the previous already done critical works and their references, and now the new dimensions that they have come up with particularly. So we've got somebody like M.H. Abraham also, or we have got somebody like F.R. Lewis also, we have got somebody like a Simon Simon de Beauvoir or Saussure. Uh, so many people are there who have greatly contributed, and the idea of neo criticism, which is quite firmly known to the American and British practices, but that came to know about the world, entire world also came to know about those very ideas. So it is in a way of a much more importance to realize how significant this period marks in the history of English literature, and also in case of studying the contemporary literature that comes after the modern period particularly. Many prominent figures across the globe have contributed in their critical, right? Earlier, this was not the case when you look at the Victorian period, or when you look at the neoclassical period or Romantic period particularly. Exactly. When we studied those periods, we definitely studied the various factors that shaped the critical thoughts and beliefs in that very particular period for sure, various characteristics of that period, and also the key figures who have greatly contributed in the very period in case of understanding the literature analysis of actual literary text and their interpretation. So these many factors we already discussed in those periods particularly, but in case of understanding modern period and the criticism or different variety of ideas that emerged and expressed their identities in a such a way that those dimensions literally put the audiences or the people who have kind of a fond, people who tend to read literary criticism exactly were seen in a wonderstruck when they also realized that those many dimensions of understanding the literature, going through the meaning. Linguistics also came into the linguistics also got into rope, and in a queue, in a way, it contributed in a very great amount otherwise in case of understanding the modern period and the thought process or belief how the criticism very particularly got shaped in modern period people, right? So it is of a much more importance to understand those various factors before we move on to literally understand. Now in today's session we are going to understand we are going to go through the in detail study of this very particular period of criticism, keeping the criticism that got published, that got in a way is widespread, and the completely, we can say, a paradigm shift in the critical ideas or criticism of the era can be seen, right? A kind of a complete paradigm shift in the criticism of that particular era can be seen, and so this remains a kind of a remarkable. Particularly, many people had, as we discussed about the prior to that, it is much more of importance to understand, mm, you know in a way, what were the various factors that have greatly contributed in shaping this very period, right? So talking about the background, yesterday we also have seen about the background of this very particular period, and we have seen how this background particularly in a way contributes to the uh, shaping of this very period particularly, guys, because this period, being one of the dominant period in the history of English literature, we can see as it spans between the first beginning of 20th century and the mid of 20th century, mid of the century can be seen. So around 6 to 7 decades are there, or almost 5 to 7 decades are there between these time span, somewhere until 1960 or 1965. The impact of this period can be seen lasting over there on the minds of the critics and the audience for sure. So yeah, या काळामध्ये पॉलिटिकल अपहिवल्स, सॉरी, या काळातले पॉलिटिकल अपहिवल्स आणि पॉलिटिकल गोष्टी ज्या काही चेंज झाल्या ना, त्या समजून घेणं सुद्धा फार महत्त्वाचं आहे, बिकॉज देअर रोल इज क्वाईट इम्पॉर्टंट otherwise in case of shaping the literary figures and all other things, right? So let's go and try to understand which were the various prominent figures who have greatly contributed in shaping of this very period, and their prominent work has made this period again, a remarkable period in history of English literary criticism and theories. So this is just kind of like a modern period, particularly, or which we can label as the 20th century literary criticism. Now, when we try to understand the 20th century literary criticism, the interdisciplinary approach can be seen greatly developed, and the main shift of academic emphasis from impressionism to formalism and originated, outside the academy in the writings of like Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, and T. Hume can be seen over there. Now, only afterward did such academics as I.R. Richards and William Empson in England, and John Crow, Ranson, and Kenneth Brooks in the United States adapted the new criticism to reform the literary curriculum, right? And in the new criticism, which has been the methodological counterpart to the strain of modernist literature. In certain respect, the new hegemony of new criticism has been, political as well as the literary, and so the anti-romantic instances. Insistence on irony or the convention and the aesthetic distance has been accompanied by the contempt of all revolutionary hopes. So, in reality, we can see the new criticism owed much to romantic theory, especially Coleridge's idea of organic form and some of its notable practices, right? And so in poetry, Paul Verlaine, Ezra Pound, then Wallace Stevens, and the theater like George Bernard Shaw, Antonia Artaud, or Bertolt Brecht, and some moralists like in fiction we can see some people like Marcel Proust, D.H. Lawrence, and Thomas Mann are the one who have contributed to the criticism in the act of justifying their art, particularly, right? Now, looking at the very prominent figures, as I discussed, like T.S. Eliot, he was an American English poet, playwright, and literary critic, and also an editor and the leader of modernist movement in poetry in such a work as The Wasteland or in a Four Quarters. So we find him exercising a strong influence on Anglo-American culture from the 1920s until the late the century, and so his experiments in diction, style, and versification, revitalized the English poetry. And in a series of critical essays, we can see him shattering the old orthodoxies and erected new ones. Right. So the publication of Four Quarters led to his recognition as the greatest living English poet and man of letters And so in 1948, we come across his awarded, when he got awarded both the Order of Merit and the Nobel Prize for Literature, right? So Eliot's principal critical works include Tradition and Individual Talent, and Hamlet and His Problems, again the Metaphysical Poets and the Use of Poetry, and the Use of Criticism, then Poetry and Drama, that got published in 1951, and On Poetry and Poets in 1957. So this won't be an exaggeration, like if we say Eliot had the strong influence of the main 20th century mainstream literary field. So Rene Wellek says about Eliot that T.S. Eliot is by far is the most important critic of the 20th century in English speaking world particularly, right? So we have got such a very prominent figure who led the movement of modern period of English literature, and so his contribution is remarkable. So many work, and while talking about the function of criticism, or in a way giving a guideline to the modern critics particularly about the critical ideas that were greatly developed in the very period. And so his contribution remains, in a way one of the influential work otherwise took taken into consideration, fine. So we have got such a very prominent figure and his prominent work. In today's session we are going to cover up those points that he has discussed in his prominent works particularly. And so we are going to start with the traditional and individual talent. Now in traditional and individual talent and its significance, so in this essay we have seen him beginning by pointing out the world. The tradition is generally regarded as a word of censure, right? It is the word disagreeable to the English ears, particularly when the English praise a poet, they praise him for the aspects of his work that are individual and original. So it is supposed that the chief merit lies in such a parts. So this undue stress on individuality shows that the English have an uncritical turn of mind, and they praise the poet for wrong thing. If they examine the matter critically with an unprejudiced mind, they will realize that the best and the most individual part of the poet's work is that which shows no the maximum influence of the writers of the past, exactly. And so in a way, so tradition matters for him, exactly. Tradition means, according to him, now here we can see in his essay Traditional and Individual Talent, while talking about the tradition, some or the other way we can see him referring to the legacy. Legacy means when a poetry is written, its aspects are taken into consideration. And he says no the laudable words that have been used to describe the poet and his a great amount of work so far. But in a way, what kind of the individual aspects of the there are several aspects of the poetry that are appreciated, and those aspects at individual level are taken into consideration for sure, exactly. And so he says that when you read the poetry with that unprejudiced mind, initially your appreciation of the poet's work, based on just only the merits or the kind of a content you go through, exactly, those impressions may find very impressive otherwise. But in a way, what matters the most is the objective collection of the various aspects of the poetry. If uh, when they are read, exactly, so they are, they are easily understood. One can easily understand that they are greatly understood. They are referred with much of reading about the past and the classical works that were introduced in the past, एक्झॅक्टली. सो त्या कवीच्या लिहिण्यातूनच त्यानं किती वाचन केलेलं आहे, किंवा त्याने कुठल्या कवीला रेफर केलेलं आहे, कुठल्या कवीची स्टाईल त्याच्या लिहिण्यामध्ये जाणवते थोडीफार, एक्झॅक्टली. सो ती स्टाईल, ती लिहिण्याची कला, ते दिसण्याचं ट्रेडिशन जे आहे ना, ती तशी त्यामध्ये आलेली दिसते, की तो कुठल्या ट्रेडिशनचा कवी आहे, कुठल्या कवीला रेफर केलंय, जेव्हा त्याच्या पोएट्री आपण अनालिसिस करायला जातो, अशा प्रकारचे इकडं ओपिनियन तो दिसतोय, राईट. अँड सो टू कोट हिज ओन वर्ड्स, ही सेज, whereas if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best but the most individual part of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. Right? So, somebody who has read greatly about Shakespeare, somebody who has greatly read about William Wordsworth, somebody who has read greatly about Lord Byron, somebody who has read greatly about P.B. Shelley, or somebody who has greatly read about Ben Jonson and his sonnets particularly, it's a reflection, the style that has been used by those many great figures can be reflected through his work. And so the kind of ideas, their way of handling ideas, their way of dealing the subject matter, their way of handling the language, their way of placing the figures of speeches in their poetry. Exactly, all those styles, when you read the poet by the, when you read the poet, when you read the poem by the modern poet, that can be seen. Exactly, and so this matters the most as it is a kind of a traditional work. Exactly, and so in a way, the poet, exactly, without these prejudices, where if we approach a poet without these prejudices, exactly, he says that we are going to get the best. Exactly, but most individual part of his work may be those in which the dead poets and his ancestors assert their immortality most vigorously. Now, looking at the history of the sense particularly, tradition does not mean blind adherence to the ways of the previous generation or generation. Exactly. So, tradition does not mean that accepting what we have got from the ancestors in a blind way, right? Blind way means without giving much thought to that and bringing into the real practice otherwise. So, in a way, tradition in the sense of passive repetition is to be discouraged. For Eliot, tradition is a matter of much wider significance. Exactly. So, tradition in the sense of passive repetition is to be discouraged. Exactly. So, when you say we are following a tradition, it means you are just going in a passive repetition. Exactly, and so this should be discouraged. Exactly, so there should not be a passive repetition of what you have inherited and you are repeating it. So your behavioral patterns are repeated according to the conditions and the situations you have come across when you say you are following a tradition, right? So जे पुढच्यांकडनं म्हणजे मागच्यांकडनं पुढच्यांपर्यंत आले ते आहे असं आंधळेपणानं वागणं किंवा तसं वर्तणूक करणं हे इथं टी.एस. सिलेटला मान्य नाही आणि म्हणतो की तो म्हणतो की हे डिस्करेज केलं पाहिजे. हे सगळ्यात पहिल्यांदा करणं टाळलं पाहिजे. म्हणजे काय, तर अंधपणाने त्याचं अवलोकन, राईट. That is not something which is expected over here. Now further we find him adding to that tradition in a true sense of the term cannot be inherited. It can only be obtained by hard labor. Exactly, and so he says that tradition has a much wider significance according to T.S. Eliot. He says that tradition is something that you cannot inherit. Exactly, tradition is something that you cannot inherit but obtain very greatly with hard labor. Exactly, and so this statement is very important over here where he talks about tradition. So he says tradition in a true sense of the term cannot be inherited. It can only be obtained by hard labor. Exactly, and so I inherit something. Exactly, and I obtain something has two different meanings. Exactly, in which you just receive it passively, and here you can see yourself quite active with those of the literary works prominently, which can be seen very much important otherwise, right? And so in a way they are very important because their references are of a much more significant to be taken into consideration, right? So it is of a great importance to realize what he has to say over here. Exactly, so it should not be merely practice. Exactly, so this labor is the labor of knowing the past writers. Exactly, so when he labelizes this hard labor, what he means that this labor is the labor of knowing the past writers. Exactly, and so thus the historical sense matters for him. It is the critical labor of shifting the good from the bad and of knowing what is good and useful. Exactly, so this labor allows you to shift the good from the bad. Exactly, so whatever conditions you are at right the moment when you start writing it, but your rigorous work of referring to the past poets who have done a kind of a classical job, in a way, it allows you to take the bad that you have with you towards the good, and thus by that you are able to know what is good and useful. Tradition can be obtained only by those who have the historical sense. Exactly, and thus this matters the most according to T.S. Eliot. The historical sense involves perception not only of the pastness of the past but also if it's a presence. One who has the historic sense feels that the whole of the literature of the Europe, right? What he feels. So talking about tradition in a very straight way, we find him referring to this very idea, which in a way otherwise generates this very concept particularly, where we find him referring to this very idea. What does he has to say over here, right? When he refers that, exactly in his own quote, exactly he says, it can be obtained only by those who have the historical sense. Now, what is historical sense? It involves a perception, exactly, not only of the pastness of the past, but also the present, and one who has the historic sense feels the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer down to his day, including the literature of his own country, forms one continuous literary tradition. Exactly. So, exactly, it is not only the pastness of the past. काहीतरी भूतकाळातलं रेफर केलंय मी हिस्ट्री म्हणून किंवा ट्रेडिशन म्हणून, तसं नाहीये. पण त्याने रेफरन्स सांगितलाय कुठपासून, अक्षरशः ते होमर पासून ते टिल नाव डेट पर्यंत, राईट. This matters the most according to him when you say when you are referring to a history, and this is it is of a much more importance according to him. हे सगळ्यात महत्वाचं आहे. तो काय म्हणतोय ते. So he realizes that the past exists in the present and that the past and the present form one simultaneous order. We are in the present, we are talking about the past, so the past is existing in the present, and so together they form an order. मी आत्ता मागच्या 4 वर्षापूर्वी घडलेल्या काहीतरी गोष्टांचा रेफरन्स करून आत्ता बोलतोय, म्हणजे माझा तो पास्ट आत्ता माझ्या या प्रेझेंट कंडिशनला माझ्या डिस्कशनमध्ये आहे. म्हणजे माझा पास्ट आणि प्रेझेंट टुगेदर आहेत आणि त्यामुळे त्याच्यामध्ये एक सिमेट्रिक ऑर्डर फॉर्म होते. एक्झॅक्टली. अँड दिस हिस्टॉरिकल सेन्स is the sense of the timeless and the temporal, as well as of the timeless and the temporal together. Exactly. So you talk about the timeless things for temporary, and you talk about temporary things for the timeless time. Exactly. Something that is timeless and something that is temporary, it is all together otherwise. This sounds very contradictory, but in a way it is all together. To further adding to this, which he says, it is this historic sense which makes us a writer traditional. Exactly. And according to him, this historic sense, exactly, which makes a writer traditional. A writer with a sense of tradition is fully conscious of his generation, of his place in the present, but he is also acutely conscious of his relationship with the writers of the past. Exactly. So, in a way, it means that जो रायटर आत्ता लिहितोय, जो पोएट आत्ता कविता करतोय, त्याचा मागचा रेफरन्स सुद्धा स्ट्रॉंग आहेच, प्लस आत्ताच्या घडामोडी काय चालल्यात याचा देखील त्याला रेफरन्स आहे. त्याचे कंटेम्पररी ऑथर्स त्याला माहित आहेत, कंटेम्पररी रायटर्स त्याला माहित आहेत, कंटेम्पररी वर्क माहित आहे, पॉलिटिकल सोशल इकॉनॉमिकल कंडिशन्स त्याला माहित आहेत. इन अ वे ही इज अवेअर अबाउट हिज प्रेझेंट हॅपनिंग्स अँड द प्रेझेंट हॅपनिंग्स इन द सराउंडिंग. अवतीभोवती जे घडतंय याचे देखील त्याला इन अ वे नॉलेज आहे, राईट. अँड सो इन अ ब्रीफ सेन्स द ट्रेडिशन इम्प्लाइज a recognition of the continuity of literature, a critical judgment as to which of the writers of the past continue to be significant in the present, and knowledge of these significant writers obtained through painstaking effort. या 3 गोष्टी खूप इंटरलिंक्ड आहेत मित्रांनो, इथे जो TS इलियट डिस्कस करतोय. आणि हा थॉट खूप महत्त्वाचा आहे. अख्खा एसे समजून घेणं गरजेचं आहे, कारण यातल्या कुठल्या एका पॉईंटवरती क्वेश्चन फ्रेम केला जातो. आणि TS इलियट ट्रेडिशन आणि इंडिव्हिज्युअल टॅलेंटमध्ये हेच सांगतोय का, असं कुठेतरी क्वेश्चन केलं जाऊ शकतं. अँड दस इट इज, आय थिंक इट इज मच मोर इम्पॉर्टंट टू हॅव द थरो नॉलेज ऑफ दिस एसे, वेअर वी फाइंड TS इलियट डिस्कसिंग tradition, what is mean by tradition, and how that individual talent is of a much more important, right? And so to talk about the sense of tradition and what it implies, exactly what it is actually, he says it implies what you have to have, a recognition of the continuity of literature, right? You are referring to the past, yeah, you are writing right now, and so you are able to continue what it has been there in the past for sure. त्यात काय होतं ते आहे. आता पुढे काय नंतर, a critical judgment as to which of the writers of the past continue to be significant in the present. Exactly. So you are continuity of literature म्हणजे काय, तर तुम्ही पास्टला रेफर करताय आणि पास्टला रेफर करत असताना यू हॅव अ जजमेंट, द क्रिटिकल जजमेंट एक्झॅक्टली of which the writers of the past continue to be significant, and so knowledge of those significant writers obtained through the painstaking effort. Exactly. So three part येतात कशामध्ये, sense of tradition मध्ये, right? So sense of tradition implies three facts. The very first is that you have a sense, the realization of continuity of literature. Second thing, when you refer to the when you are in the continuity of literature, you are referring to the past authors, exactly, and you have the critical judgment of those authors whose work is in the continuation of in the past present also. And so when you take rigorous efforts to know about the those significant writers or prominent figures, right? So tradition represents the accumulated wisdom and experience. So in a way, we realize that this tradition refers, right, to the accumulated wisdom and experience of ages, and so its knowledge is essential for really great and noble achievements, right? So this tradition, what is this tradition? It is the accumulated wisdom and experience of ages. अनेक वर्षांपासून ज्या ज्या पिरियडमध्ये जे जे ग्रेट लोक आले होते ना, त्यांच्या कामाची, त्यांच्या स्टाईलची, त्यांच्या लँग्वेजची, या सगळ्या आणि अजून अनेक ॲट्रिब्यूट्सची जेव्हा एक ॲक्युमुलेटेड सेन्सिबिलिटी तुमच्याकडे येते आणि त्या सगळ्याचा एक इसेन्स तुमच्यामध्ये तयार होतो ना, तेव्हा तुम्ही ते ट्रेडिशन फॉलो करत असता. So when you feel, when you write, you develop the style of Shakespeare. When you write, when you refer a lot to Wordsworth, you find you are referring to the language that has been used by Wordsworth. When you refer to a lot to the Coleridge, exactly, reflections of those referring can be seen in your writing, right? And that's where somewhere he talks that this is how the tradition works particularly. To add to this further, he talks about the function of tradition. Yes, and to add to that, right, while talking about the function of tradition, we find him referring very greatly about a very interesting part where he says the work of a poet in the present is to be compared and contrasted with works of the past and judged by the standards of the past. Okay, now referring to what he has stated over here, right, he says the work of the poet in the present to be compared and contrasted with works of the past and judged by the standards of the past. Exactly. So you have got a work in a present and you compared it with the past. Exactly. Right. So can we say in a way he is somewhere trying to proceed with what Arnold had talked in touchstone method, right? Yes, Arnold's touchstone method somewhere. So we find Matthew Arnold, who is considered as a referring figure, right? Who is considered as the most prominent and referring figure of the period otherwise, right? He remains an interesting figure or referring figure of the period particularly, right? But now when he say this judgment does not mean determining good or bad. It does not mean deciding whether the present work is better or worse than the work of the past, right? Exactly. It is nothing but a kind of just only a comparison. Exactly. So he says this judgment does not mean determining good or bad, or does not mean deciding whether the present work is better or worse than the works of the past. An author in the present is certainly not to be judged by the principles and the standards of the past. The comparison is to be made for knowing the facts, all the facts about the new work of art. एक्झॅक्टली. मॉडर्न पोएट्री ही मॉडर्न पोएटसारखीच लिहायला हवी, पण पोएट्री लिहायला कशी हवी हे शिकण्यासाठी जुन्या कवींना रेफर करणं गरजेचं आहे. सब्जेक्ट मॅटर कसा हँडल केला जातो हे शिकण्याची गरजेचं आहे. एक्झॅक्टली. सो यू डेव्हलप द स्किल of handling the subject matter. You handle the subject matter, you handle the language, you play with the language, exactly, but you refer to them, right? So when you talk about Shakespeare, you realize he's playing with the language in a significant way. ज्या रीतीने शेक्सपियर त्या भाषेसोबत काय खेळला आहे, एक्झॅक्टली, ज्यानं ज्या स्टाईलने त्याने ती भाषा वापरली आहे, ज्या स्टाईलने त्याने ते नरेशन्स तयार केलेले आहेत, एक्झॅक्टली ती स्टाईल तुम्ही शिकता, राईट? अँड दॅट्स लर्निंग ऑफ द स्टाईल अँड नो that essence matters the most according to him, right? So an author in the present is certainly not to be judged by the principles and standards of the past. And there is there is no relevance as such. They are all relevant, right? The comparison is to be made knowing the facts, all the facts about the new work of art, and the comparison is made for analysis and for forming a better understanding of the new. एक्झॅक्टली तुम्ही कुठला फॉर्म हँडल करताय, एक्झॅक्टली त्या फॉर्मचे 5 रेफरन्सेस, एक्झॅक्टली वेदर यू आर डीलिंग विथ अ नॉवेल, एक्झॅक्टली वेदर यू आर डीलिंग विथ अ ड्रामा or whether you are dealing with a poetry, whichever new you are referring, exactly तुम्ही आता जे काही रेफर करत आहे न्यू, एक्झॅक्टली त्या न्यू रेफरन्समध्ये एक्झॅक्टली ह्या गोष्टी ॲड होणं अत्यंत महत्त्वाचं आहे. अँड दिस इज अकॉर्डिंग टू T.S. Eliot, right? Let's see what he has to say further. Moreover, right, this comparison is reciprocal. The past helps us to understand the present, and the present throws light on the past. It is in this way alone that we can form an idea of what is individual and new. It is by comparison alone that we can shift the traditional from the individual elements in a given work of art. Exactly. So he says this comparison is reciprocal. Exactly. You compare it, it compares you, right? And in a way, this is a reciprocal process. So it helps us to understand the present, and so the past helps us to understand the present, and the present throws light on the past. So in this way alone that we can form an idea of what is individual and new. Exactly. T.S. Eliot's poetry is T.S. Eliot's poetry. Exactly. Though he talks about metaphysical poet, he refers to the greatest of all times of works in a way, but yet T.S. Eliot's come with his individual style. Exactly. And so he says that this individual and new, and by it is comparison alone that we can shift the traditional from the individual elements in a given work of art. Now let's move ahead what he has to say about now the sense of tradition. It's a real meaning. Now we find Eliot becoming, in a way, more of an opinion, right? So let's see what he has to say when he says the sense of tradition. The sense of tradition does not mean that the poet should try to know the past as a whole, take it to be a lump or a mass without any discrimination. Such a course is impossible as well as undesirable, not even expected. Exactly. The past must be examined critically, and only the significance in it should be acquired. Right? तुम्हाला ते वेचता यायला पाहिजे. वेचणं, गोळा करायचं नाहीये, वेचायचं आहे. म्हणजे काय, तुम्हाला जे पाहिजे तेच तुम्ही कलेक्ट करता. Exactly. And so your critical perception matters the most in that case, where you are able to pick up only which is required and significant. And so he says, exactly. So what he says, the sense of tradition does not also mean that the poet, exactly. So he means that the poet should know only a few poets whom he admires. This is a sign of immaturity and inexperience. Neither should a poet be content merely to know some particular age or period which he likes. This may be delightful, but it will not constitute a sense of tradition. Exactly. हा, म्हणजे ठराविक कवींनाच रेफर करणं कारण मला ते आवडत आहेत किंवा एका विशिष्ट पिरियड मधलेच कवी मला फार चांगले वाटत आहेत, एक्झॅक्टली ते चालेल. एक्झॅक्टली तसं करणं ठीक आहे, पण ते पूर्णतः ट्रेडिशनला कॉन्स्टिट्यूट करत नाही, फ्रेम करत नाही. एक्झॅक्टली. तो त्याने रेफरन्स दिला आहे होमर पासून ते आत्तापर्यंतचा रेफरन्स, राईट? So he states very, clearly over here with us, where he has to say, when he talks about the saints of tradition. Tradition म्हणजे नेमकं काय? Exactly. Traditionचा sense असणं म्हणजे काय? Exactly. So he says, right, where we find him, neither should a poet be content, satisfy merely to know some particular age or period which he likes. This may be delightful, त्यांना आनंद मिळेल, but it will not constitute a sense of tradition. The sense of tradition in the real sense means a consciousness of the main current which does not at all flow invariably through the most distinguished reputations. Exactly, right? And this is a very remarkable sentence that he makes. Exactly, a sense of tradition in a means the main current which does not at all flow invariably, separate nahi hai, through the most distinguished reputations. In other words, to know the tradition, the poet must judge critically what are the main trends, what is not. He must confine himself, restrict himself to the main trends to the exclusion of all that is incidental or topical. So the poet must possess the critical gift in ample measure. He must also realize, he must also realize that the main literary trends are not determined by the great poets alone. Exactly. And so these great trends are not literally determined by the poet alone. Audiences, they are not to be ignored. Exactly. Smaller poets also are significant. त्यामुळे ठराविक लोकांनाच घेणं, ठराविक लोकांना वाचणं. एक्झॅक्टली. रोमॅन्टिक पिरियडमध्ये मी वर्ड्सवर्थ वाचला, कोलरिज वाचला म्हणजे माझं रोमॅन्टिक पिरियडचं रेटिंग संपलं असं म्हणू शकत नाही. इतकं बेसिक रिस्ट्रिक्शन आपलं असणं आवश्यक नाही. Exactly. And so we have to take this into very consideration, people, about referring to those, right? And thus here we realize the conscious approach of T.S. Eliot about the criticism that will be made in his theory of tradition. So his views of tradition requires, it will be said, a ridiculous amount of erudition. It will be pointed out that there have been a great poets who were not learned, and further that too much learning kills sensibility. However, knowledge does not merely mean bookish knowledge, and the capacity for acquiring knowledge differs from person to person. Some can absorb knowledge, easily, while others must sweat for it, have to put hard efforts otherwise. And so let's take an example of William Shakespeare, who could know more of the Roman history from Plutarch to most of the main can from the British Museum. So every poet must acquire to the best of his ability and to his knowledge of the past, and he must continue to acquire his consciousness through his career. So such a awareness of tradition sharpens the poetic creation. So further he talks about the impersonality of poetry, the extinction of personality. So what he states over here, let's say, the artist must continually surrender himself to something more valuable than himself, that is the literary tradition. Exactly, your devotion, your passion allows you to mingle with what you have been doing in a great passionate way. Exactly, you cannot see inseparable. Poetry and you are not different. You are poetry, and poetry is within you if you are a poet, right? So artist must have that kind of continuous possessive approach, right? The literary tradition, right? So the poet must allow his poetic sensibility to be shaped and modified by the past. Referring to the past, reading a lot, exactly, that is what he wants over here. So he says he must continue to acquire a sense of tradition throughout his career. It is not just only a period of time. एका ठराविक काळापुरतं नाही आहे, कोणतं की हे आयुष्यभर चालणार आहे. लॉंग टर्ममध्ये चालणारं असं एक प्रोसेस आहे की जे त्या माणसाने कंटिन्यू केली पाहिजे. सो इन द बिगिनिंग हिज सेल्फ, हिज इंडिव्हिज्युअलिटी may assert itself, but as he powers mature, there must be, exactly, as the powers mature, there must be a greater and greater extinction of personality. He must acquire greater and greater objectivity. His emotions and passion must be depersonalized. He must be as impersonal and objective as a scientist. रेफर करत असताना कुणाला टू डेव्हलप द ट्रॅडिशनल द सेन्स ऑफ ट्रॅडिशन एक्झॅक्टली टू डेव्हलप द सेन्स ऑफ ट्रॅडिशन तो काय सांगतोय कशा करता प्रचंड इम्पर्सनल असणं अनबायस्ड असणं टोटली न्यूट्रल असणं गरजेचं आहे when you are referring to the past or the process of referring the past or going taking the help of the past or assistance of past. So yes, so the personality of the artist is not important. The important thing is the sense of tradition. A good poem is a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. Exactly. So ती पोएम कशी अशी लिव्हिंग पोएम असावी जी आत्तापर्यंत लिहिलेल्या सगळ्या पोएमचं प्रतिनिधित्व करते किंवा त्यांच्या परीने उभा राहते. He must forget his joys and sorrows, and he absorbed in acquiring a sense of tradition and expressing in his poetry. So, and thus the poet's personality is merely a medium having the same significance as catalytic agent or a receptacle 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 in which chemical reactions take place. And that is why Eliot holds that honest criticism and sensitive, exactly, honest criticism and sensitive approach is directed not upon the poet but by the poetry. And so, referring to what he is stating over here is of a much more significance otherwise, right? What he states over here, the honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet but the poetry. Yes. So a poet should be like a catalyst, right? That matters the most. Who is there in the process but not involved at all. Involved but not making an impact. Exactly. The style, the poetry, its individual talent, it all has to be there. Exactly. The kavita hoti hai, the kavita express होते है अपने live poem, the lively poem that matters the most people, right? And this is what he wants to say when he refers to this very particular term, the impersonality of poetry, extension of personality. Exactly how impersonal the poet should be in case of referring to what he is writing. Exactly his position approach, the achievements that he is expecting some or the other way. And now, before we move to the poetic process or the analogy of poetry, let's take a break for 5 minutes. By the way, guys, we are talking about T.S. Eliot and his prominent work, and we are referring to an interesting part. Don't miss out this. Let us continue with what he had to state over here. Hello and welcome back to our lecture series on modern period of literary criticism, and we are talking about the prominent figures in 20th century literary criticism, and we are highlighting the prominent figure, one of the prominent figure of not just only in modern period but in the history of English literary criticism, T.S. Eliot, right? And let's go and continue with what he has stated, understanding, right? We have talking about his essay, particularly where he talks about tradition and individual talent, where he talks about what is meant by tradition, how this tradition in a way is considered with individual talent particularly, right? And he says the sense of tradition, how the sense of tradition is perceived, how referring to the past matters the most, and all sort of things. And so now we are talking about the poetic process and the analogy of the catalyst. Exactly. So refers to, now when he talks about the analogy of the catalyst, we really find out that he talks about the poet. Exactly. And how the poet is somewhere there between the very experience of poetry, the poetry, between the actual formation of poetry and the experience of poetry. In between this very process, he is the catalyst. Actually, he is there in the process, but he is not influencing or affected by that very process. So in the second part of this essay, we find Eliot developing the further of his theory of the impersonality of poetry. So he compares the mind of the poet to a catalyst, and to the process of poetic creation to the process of chemical reaction. Just as chemical reactions take place, in the presence of a catalyst alone, so also the poet's mind is the catalytic agent for combining different emotions into something new. Suppose, right, there is a jar of containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. These two gases combine to form sulfurous acid when a fine filament of platinum is introduced into the jar. The combination takes place only in the presence of the piece of platinum, right? But the metal itself does not undergo any change. It remains in turn, right, neutral and unaffected, right? So it is like the jar. So the mind of the poet is like the catalytic, exactly, catalytic agent. So the new combination of emotions and experiences must take place, but it does not undergo any change during the process of poetic combination. So the mind of the poet is constantly forming emotions and experiences into the new wholes, exactly the new wholes. And so the new combination, exactly, but the new combination does not contain even a trace of poet's mind and right, and it should be something like this. So just as the newly formed sulfurous acid does not contain any trace of the platinum, in the case of a young and immature poet, his mind, his emotions and experiences may find some expressions in his composition, but Eliot says the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates, exactly. And so this role of catalyst is much more significant according to William Wordsworth, right? And so we find him stating over here in this way the perfect of the combination of what he has to say over here, right? And so this somehow this matters the most, people. So the combination plays a kind of like a vital role. Moving forward, exactly. So he says the test of maturity of an artist is the completeness with which his main digests and transmutes the passions which form the substance of his poetry. The personality of the poet does not find expressions in his poetry, it acts as a catalytic agent in the process of poetic comparison. Further, he talks about emotions and feelings. Another segment of his essay, The Tradition and Individual Talent. The experiences which enter the poetic process, says Eliot, that may be of two kinds. There are emotions and feelings. Poetry may be composed out of emotions only, or out of feelings only, or out of both. Now, here we find him making a difference between the emotions and feelings, but he does not state what this difference is particularly. Nowhere else in his writings, exactly, there is a distinction maintained, neither does he adequately distinguish between the meaning of the two words. The distinction should therefore be ignored, more so as it is no bearing on his impersonal theory of poetry. Feelings and emotions, we talk about that. Now, poetry as an organization, intensity of the poetic process. His next comparison is the poet's mind to a jar, or the receptacle in which are stored numberless feelings, emotions, etc., which remain there, according to him, in an unorganized and chaotic form till what moment? Till all particles which can unite to form a new compound are present together. Exactly. So the mind, like a jar, is in possession of so many emotions and feelings, and when these right feelings, the right emotions, all those right elements are compounded together to form a something new. And this something new cannot be formed until they are together, exactly with their assimilating notions. Right? Further, we find him saying that thus poetry is an organization rather than inspiration. It is organization of so many prominent elements, those emotions together, rather, right? That's what we find him studying over here, exactly. And yes, and the greatness of a poem does not depend on the greatness or even the intensity of the emotions which are the components of the poem, but it depends upon the intensity of the process of poetic composition. Exactly, what kind of intensity really lies in the composition of the very process. So just as the chemical reaction takes place under pressure, and so also intensity is needed for the fusion of emotions. So the more intense the poetic process, the more greater the poem. The more intense it is, the greater the poem is kind of factor. So this is always a difference between the artistic emotion and the personal emotions of the poet. For example, the famous Ode to Nightingale by John Keats contains a number of emotions that have nothing to do with the nightingale. The difference between the art and the event is always absolute. So, the poet has no personality to express, he is merely a medium in which impressions and experiences combine in a peculiar and unexpected way. So, the impressions and experiences, in a way, which are significant for the man, may find no place in his poetry, and those which become important in the poetry may have no significance for the man. So, Eliot thus rejects romantic subjectivism. Exactly. So, whatever the subjective thoughts that were put forth by the Romantics could be seen denounced over here by T.S. Eliot in a very perfect way otherwise. Now, what is his idea on artistic emotions? The value of concentration. According to him, now the emotion of poetry is different from the personal emotions of the poet. Exactly. So he keeps aside his personal emotions, feelings, and he writes for the sake of the poetry. So the poetry's emotions and the emotions of the poet are totally different. How they are different, he signifies very interestingly. He says that his emotions may be simple or crude, but the emotions of the poetry may be complex and refined. It is the mistaken notion that the poet must express new emotions that results in many eccentrics in poetry. It is not the business of the poet to find a new emotions. He may express he may express only ordinary emotions, but they must impart to them in a new significance and new meaning, and they do not need to be his emotions. Even emotions that he has never personally experienced can serve the purpose of the poetry. For example, emotions that result from the reading of books can serve his turn. So he rejects what Wordsworth's theory of poetry having its origin in emotions recollected in tranquility. And so he points out that in the process of poetic composition, there is neither emotion nor recollection nor tranquility. It is all a different business. Exactly, it is all a different function. Otherwise, that's what we find William Wordsworth studying. Sorry, T.S. Eliot studying over here while defending to what or while countering to what William Wordsworth had said in Lyrical Ballads. So, in the poetic process, there is only concentration of many experiences. You have got like so here again the catalyst, the jar, the oxygen, sulfur, exactly, and so the sulfuric acid and no combination, त्या जारचा काहीच रोल नाहीये त्यामध्ये एक्झॅक्टली तो जार फक्त तिथे प्रोसेस घडून आणतोय एक्झॅक्टली सो इतकं इम्पॅक्टलेस राहायचं त्या पोएटने त्या पोएटच्या माइंडने कॅटलिस्ट एक्झॅक्टली आणि तो म्हणून म्हणतो की काय आहे तर जसा तो कंपाऊंड तयार होत नाही केमिकल रिॲक्शनचा अनेक एक्सपेरिन्सेस कलेक्ट झाल्याशिवाय आणि त्याचा एक नवीन फॉर्म, तो नवीन फॉर्म त्या एक्सपिरियन्स म्हणजे काय, तर ती पोएट्री आहे अदरवाईज. सो ही सेज in the poetic process there is only concentration of many experiences, concentration of many experiences, and this process of concentration is neither conscious nor deliberate, it is a passive one. And so there is no doubt that there are elements in the poetic process which is conscious and deliberate. Further, he adds, the difference between a good and bad poet is that a bad poet is conscious where he should be unconscious, and unconscious where he should be conscious. It is this consciousness of the wrong kind which makes a poem personal, whereas mature art must be impersonal. Exactly, where he learns to be unconscious where he was supposed to. Exactly, right? जिथे अनकॉन्शियस होते तिकडे अनकॉन्शियस व्हायचं कळतं, म्हणून त्यामधून एक मॅच्युअर आर्ट डेव्हलप होते. एक्झॅक्टली. बट एलियट डज नॉट टेल अस when a poet should be conscious and when not. So the point has been left vague and indeterminate. ते काय एलियटने सांगितलं नाही, राईट. सो हे फार महत्वाचा विषय आहे. Further, we have objective correlative. Now, the theory of objective correlative is one of the most important critical concepts of T.S. Eliot. No, he stated, a tremendous, he had, he left a tremendous influence on the critical temper of the 20th century due to his objective correlative and few of the prominent notions he had about that, right? Very significantly otherwise. The term objective correlative, according to him, right? The term objective correlative was first used by American painter Washington Allston, right? And it was in 19th century, and later it was revived by T.S. Eliot. In the concept of objective correlative, his doctrine of poetic impersonality finds its most classic formulation. He formulated his doctrine of the objective correlative in his essays on Hamlet and his problems. And as per his opinion, a poet cannot communicate his emotions directly to the readers. He has to find some object suggestive of it, and only then he can evoke the same emotion in his readers. So, objective correlative is a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be, the formula of that particular emotion, such that when the external facts which must terminate in sensory experience are given, the emotion is immediately evoked. So the stimulants are present, and those stimulants indirectly representing those emotions are successful in evoking of those emotions. The emotions जे स्टिम्युलंट्स आहेत ते त्यांचं काम ऍक्टिव्हली करतात, ज्यातून ते ज्या इमोशनला रिप्रेझेंट करतात त्या इमोशन्स इवोक होतात, राईट. And it is through the objective correlative that the transaction between author and the reader necessarily happen. For this object, exactly, because of this only, object is the primary source of and the demand for the reader's response, whatever that may be, and it is also the primary foundation for whatever inferences we may draw about what it is that the author wanted to say. Exactly, exactly. So ते वाचल्यानंतर काय इमोशन्स इवोक होतात ना, त्यातून त्या ऑथरला काय म्हणायचं आहे याची लिंक लागण्याची गोष्ट तयार होते, असं टी.एस. इलियट म्हणतोय. म्हणून तशा इमोशन्स त्या ऑब्जेक्टच्या मार्फत प्रोड्यूस करणं गरजेचं आहे, डायरेक्ट सांगून चालत नाही. We've got some examples for sure about this, right? Where he has, for example, the object is primary source, and exactly, so he says, right? Briefly speaking, what does he mean? Yes, and in the doctrine of the objective correlate is that a great work of art is nothing but a set of conceptual symbols or correlatives which take effort to express the emotions of the poet, and these symbols form the total vision of the creative artist. त्या कवीला काय म्हणायचं आहे, त्या आर्टिस्टला काय म्हणायचं आहे, त्यानं जे ऑब्जेक्ट चूज केले ते सांगण्यासाठी, त्या ऑब्जेक्टचे जे काही स्टिम्युलंट्स आहेत, त्या स्टिम्युलंट्स त्या ऑब्जेक्टमधून रिलीज होतात. ते स्टिम्युलंट्स तशा प्रकारच्या इमोशन्स इवोक करतात, म्हणजे त्याला जे काही म्हणायचं आहे ते सांगण्यासाठी सेट केलेले काही ऑब्जेक्टिव्ह आहेत. अँड सो इलियस साइट्स an example to prove his doctrine from Shakespeare's Macbeth. In Macbeth, Shakespeare has to convey the mental agony of Lady Macbeth, and so he does so in the sleepwalking scene, not through the description, but an unconscious repetition of her past actions. Exactly. So, talk about the mental agony, right? And so, her mental agony has been made objective so that it can as well be seen by the eyes as felt by the heart. And so, the external situation is quite enough to convey emotions, exactly, and the agony of the Lady Macbeth. Now, rather than directly communicating the emotions to the reader, exactly, Shakespeare has embodied them in a situation or a chain of events which in a perfect way communicate to the emotions of the readers. त्या कॅरेक्टरच्या वागण्यानं कळते, प्रिस्क्रिप्शन नाही दिलं, राग आला, बोलला, एक्झॅक्टली, अडखळणं, रिपिटेटिव्ह बोलणं, एक्झॅक्टली. सो ते त्या कॅरेक्टरला ॲट्रिब्यूट अलाइन करून, असाइन करून, त्याच्या थ्रू ते करून घेऊन त्याची मेंटल स्टेट, such a kind of a skill to describe about the objective correlative, how that object correlates with the emotions of the authors, or what author wants to convey the emotions to the readers or the audiences in a way otherwise, right? And so is a dissociation of sensibility. The idea of dissociation of sensibility is first used in the essay The Metaphysical Poets that got produced in 1921, right? So there he tried to find some kind of historical explanations for the dissolutions of the tradition of unified sensibility, which found its perfection in the writings of the Dante and Shakespeare. And the unified sensibility was a sensibility that was the product of the true synthesis of the individual with the traditional of the feeling, with the thought of the temporal with the eternal. It was not representative of the mind of Europe, but also the traditions of European thought and culture. But unfortunately, according to Eliot, the traditions of united sensibility were suddenly disturbed in the 17th century as a result of a split in the creative personality of the artist, for which he formulated his um, the famous theory of dissociation of the sensibility. And so he makes this idea clear in the following words. We may express difference by the following theory, that the poets of the 17th century, the successors of the dramatists of the 16th, possessed a mechanism of sensibility which could devour any kind of experience. So 16व्या शतकातल्या ड्रामॅटिस्टचं स्किल कुणी पदेस केलं होतं किंवा कुणी पुढे चाललं होतं, तर ते होतं 17व्या शतकातल्या कवींनी, एक्झॅक्टली, आणि ते अतिशय उत्तमरित्या पुढे घेतलं होतं. फर्दर ही ॲड्स, दे आर सिम्पल, आर्टिफिशियल, डिफिकल्ट और फंटॅस्टिक as their predecessors were, no less nor more than Dante, Guido, Cavalcanti, Gonzali, or Chino. Now, in the 17th century, a dissociation of sensibility set in, from which we have never recovered, and this dissociation, as is natural, was aggravated by the influence of the two most powerful poets of the century, Milton and John Dryden. And so, by sensibility, it does not mean merely feeling or the capacity to receive sense impressions. He means much more than that. Exactly. So he means a synthetic faculty a faculty which can amalgamate and unite through, unite thought and feeling, exactly, which can fuse into a single whole, varied and dissimilar, often opposite and contradictory experiences, the sensuous and intellectual. Right? Let us read again what he wants to say over here, where when he says, exactly, he means a synthetic faculty, right? A faculty which can amalgamate, means which can mix and unite the thought and the feelings, which can fuse into a single whole, the varied and dissimilar, and often opposite and contradictory experiences, the sensuous and the intellectual. Such a kind of a faculty. इतके सगळे अट्रॅक्शन आहे की ज्याला समजू शकतं पण समजणार पण नाही, जे न समजणार आहे अशांचं समजून घेण्याची कॅपेबिलिटी, एक्झॅक्टली जे वेगळे आहेत ते सगळ्यांना एकत्र करून कलेक्ट करून त्यांची व्हरायटी तरी पण एकत्रितपणे समजून घेण्याचं स्किल. So such kind of things are there, exactly. And before we move to understand the prominent figure of this period, let us just revise what we have talked in this very particular uh, right. So we are referring to the 20th century modern period. No, while talking about this, we talked about the prominent figures people. की या 20th century लिटरेचरला कोणी जनरली रूल केलं किंवा कोण आहेत प्रॉमिनंट फिगर्स, आपण त्यातल्या एका प्रॉमिनंट फिगरबद्दल आता बोलतोय. आणि आपण अजून अशा वेगवेगळ्या प्रॉमिनंट फिगर्सबद्दल बोलणार आहोत ज्यांचं काम अत्यंत महत्त्वाचं आहे आणि ज्यांनी स्वतंत्र आयडेंटिटी सेट केल्या. Okay, as I stated, in the beginning of this lecture, that it is much more important to understand the essay in a perfect way, because we may have a questions based on various ideas that were put forth by those many prominent critics. Like, let's take an example of T.S. Eliot. Exactly, T.S. Eliot has written a few essays, and his ideas are different in those very essays, where he talks about poetry, his comparisons of the art, his comparisons of the emotions, his ideas. Exactly, so many ideas that are there that he has put forth so far, and we just had a brief summarized account, of those various ideas that he has tried to put forth in his various essays. Exactly, like essays like individual talent, exactly, touched on, where he refers to the idea, right, where he refers to the, sayings that the significance of a poetry is of a much more important in case of realizing. He talks about the role of a mind, role of the poet. He talks about the tradition. So many things are there. Let's just revise them. So it is much more important, as I stated, to understand the essay in an entire way, right? सो मग आपण आत्ता एक त्याला काय काय बघितलं जरा त्याचा रेफरन्स घेऊयात. T.S. इलियट हा कोण आहे, तर एक अमेरिकन इंग्लिश पोएट आहे, प्ले राईट आहे. आणि त्याने आत्तापर्यंत वेगवेगळ्या त्याच्या ह्याच्यामध्ये एक खूप सर्टन अमाऊंट ऑफ मेरिट सेट केलं. असा इतका महान कवी आहे हा की ही इज नॉट जस्ट ओनली फेमस फॉर ही इज नॉट जस्ट ओनली फेमस for the poet or the prominent figure of modern period, but in the entire history of English literature. He is somebody who has been awarded with Nobel prize for the literature particularly, and the order of merit, right. Now having a kind of a brief account of his works that include tradition and individual talent, then Hamlet and his problems, then metaphysical poets, and then use of poetry and the use of criticism, poetry and drama, and on the poetry and the poets. So this is not an exaggeration, where we realize that he is the one who influenced the mainstream 20th century literary criticism particularly, and thus he remains a kind of a significant factor. Now, talking about traditional individual talent, we find him talking about the traditional elements and their significance, where he ensures that how tradition is something which means, ओके, नक्की ट्रेडिशन म्हणजे काय आहे, ट्रेडिशनचा रोल काय असतो, ट्रेडिशनचं फंक्शन कसं असतं, आणि अशा अजून इतर 4-2 गोष्टींबद्दल आपण याला इथे प्रॉमिनंटली बोलताना बघताना बोलताना डिस्कस करताना ऐकतो, त्याच्यामुळे तो या सगळ्याचं महत्त्व सांगतो, राईट. And we also find him stating the historical sense, particularly when he refers to tradition, right? And it is not, he says that it is not, I'm sorry, it is not just a mere acceptance to what we have got from the past, exactly. So he says that a past, thinking of past, past and present, and its a togetherness is quite important. So it is a matter of much more wider significance. And so he says that it's a true sense term cannot be inherited. So तो ये खूप महत्त्वाचं सांगतो की ट्रेडिशन ही इनहेरिट केली जाऊ शकत नाही, ती खूप सगळ्या एफर्ट्सने आपण काय करतो ऑप्टेन करतो. आणि हे तेच लोक ऑप्टेन करू शकतात ज्यांना हिस्टोरिकल सेन्स आहे. त्यामुळे हिस्टोरिकल सेन्स असणं अत्यंत महत्त्वाचं आहे. राईट. Further, we find him talking about no, uh, writer with sense of tradition, with sense of tradition सांगितला, historical sense सांगितला, sense of tradition सांगितला, आणि त्याने एक 3 फॅक्टर सांगितले की कुणाला म्हणायचं की recognition of continuity in literature, exactly, then critical judgment to the whole of writers, right? And then he talked about knowledge of those particular persons. Then he talks about functions of tradition. Tradition नक्की काय काम करते, कशा प्रकारे ती वर्क होते. त्याने त्याचं कंपॅरिझन केलं की फॅक्ट्स म्हणजे काय आहेत, सगळ्या फॅक्ट्स कशातून, आणि त्याचं analysis, exactly. So the comparison is made for the analysis and forming a kind of a better understanding. So the comparison is quite reciprocal. So the past helps us to understand the present, and the present throws light on the past. And so it is in this way alone we can form a new idea that is what individual and totally new, right? Then we found him talking about the sense of tradition and its real meaning. What is mean by sense of tradition, and how it is different from just only understanding the tradition through the sensory organs, or just only it's a sensory objects, right? And how vast kind of a meaning it has with itself, right? Further, we talked about the impersonality, where he said that this very process, while talking about comparing the catalyst process of the chemical reaction and the poetic mind, which it should be rather just only an the present element, but does not get affected by any sort of a reaction, or it does not influence the reaction at all, right? And so that kind of impersonality of the poetry, it's a extinction of the personality, how your personality should be extincted, it should be carried out from the poetical process or the poetical pressure that takes place particularly, or the very intensity of experience, right? Further, we talked about the poetic process, the analogy of the catalyst, which is quite significant in detail, right? Then we move to talking about sorry. Then we move to talking about the very significant factor, which is just that poetry as a organization, right? There are several objects, and those objects, it is not a process rather, but it is not just only an inspiration, but it is an organization. Otherwise, there are several emotions in the minds of the poem, exactly, त्या मनामध्ये स्टोअर केलेले असतात, आणि जेव्हा ते असेम्बलेटिंग ऑब्जेक्ट्स एकत्र येतात तेव्हा त्यांचं एक युनिट न्यू व्हर्जन तयार होतं, आणि ते ऑर्गनाइज्ड होतात एका सर्टन वेने, आणि त्यांचं ऑर्गनायझेशन अशा प्रकारे काम करतं. म्हणून ती एक काय आहे, तर पोएट्री एक काय ऑर्गनायझेशन आहे. अशा प्रकारचं आपण त्याचं ओपिनियन बघितलं, राईट. देन वी टॉक्ट अबाउट आर्टिस्टिक इमोशन, द व्हॅल्यू ऑफ कॉन्सन्ट्रेशन, राईट. सो आर्टिस्टिक इमोशन्स, त्यासाठी लागणारे ऑब्जेक्ट्स आणि आर्टिस्टिक इमोशन्स बाजूला ठेवून, जे त्या पोएटच्या फॉर्मसाठी रिक्वायर्ड आहे, तिथल्या कंटेंटसाठी, सब्जेक्टसाठी रिक्वायर्ड आहे, त्या इमोशन्स डेव्हलप करून त्या एका सर्टन ऑब्जेक्टच्या थ्रू कशा पुढे पास ऑन करायच्या, याच्याबद्दल पण आपण बोललो, एक्झॅक्टली. अँड देन वी फायनली टॉक्ट अबाउट ऑब्जेक्टिव्ह कोरिलेटिव्ह, अँड ऑल्सो वी टॉक्ट अबाउट दी सॉरी दी sensibility, right? The disassociation of sensibility particularly. So this was all about T.S. Eliot and his greatest amount of contribution, right? In our tomorrow's lecture, we are going to start with I.A. Richards, who also remains one of the prominent figure in the modern period actually, and also has greatly contributed in shaping various critical ideologies and thoughts in the very